So first, let's start with the foundation of the instrument, which we're going to call the frame. Now, the frame, or the overall structure of the instrument, actually refers to a few different components. It is the iron frame, but it is also the outer rim and the beaming structure that supports all of that from below. And the role of the frame of the instrument is both to sustain and fight against the incredible tension that the strings put on it, but it's also to act as a secondary resonating element of the instrument. A lot of the nuance you get out of higher end grand pianos are actually coming off elements of the piano that are not the soundboard. And so the better the design and better constructed the frame you get, the more of these nuanced extra elements often are present in the sonic presentation of the instrument. So the first element we're going to take a look at is the iron plate. Now, this is the gold part, or at least on most pianos it's gold. You see other colors such as black and white starting to make it into the mainstream. But this is generally made out of an iron alloy, which is supposed to really just sustain the tension that the strings exert on the piano when they're tightened up. This is really where the 20 tons of tension that you'll often hear referenced, that's what it's referring to. And so the frame has kind of an interesting engineering tightrope it needs to walk. It obviously needs to be strong enough so that it can fight against that tension, but it has to be open enough that it's going to allow as much sound from the soundboard as possible to escape, while also not actually having any physical contact with the soundboard whatsoever. Now, the frame is anchored to the rim, and depending on the grand piano, you're either going to have what they refer to as a continuously bent rim, such as what Steinway does, or an inner and outer rim structure. Now, this is something that's actually a lot easier to see from underneath the instrument, but even still, you can tell that there's obviously a bit of a ledge here that the iron plate is sitting on. And that's what all of these bolts are actually drilled down into. So this plate is pulled tightly down onto the inner rim, and that inner rim is made of a very sophisticated set of laminations. And because there is some reverberation coming through the plate can actually activate that inner and outer rim somewhat to create some vibrational energy, which it turns into this extra sort of cabinet resonance. And then underneath the piano, there's an entire radial beaming structure. Now, I should mention not all pianos use a radial beaming structure, but a lot of them do. And what this does is essentially ensure that any vibrational energy that is reaching the rim is able to distribute that vibration evenly right around the entire piano. So that even if you have a vibrational source over at this part of the instrument, that the entire rim of the piano is actually going to activate and start vibrating. This is one of the big differences between a more basic grand piano and a more advanced concert level grand piano. There's a tremendous amount of craftsmanship and engineering that goes into making sure that that rim is activating, but the more basic you get on a grand piano, that outer rim really is just functioning almost strictly in a structural sense. There's very little time and attention being paid to try and make that rim a high-end acoustic element or to ensure that it's really vibrating along with the piano. Now, there's a few questions we often get about the shape of a grand piano. For instance, why is it not just a rectangle, and why do we have this curve? Moreover, why do some of the curves on the back of an instrument seem a lot more narrow, while other ones almost seem to be squared off? And this has a lot to do with what we call scale design. And scale design refers to really the whole combination of configurations of elements such as the bridge placement on the soundboard, the string tension, etc., etc. But you can see that the curve of the instrument actually generally matches the line of the bridges that you can see on the inside. So the curvature is there so that we're basically maintaining a fairly similar level of soundboard on either side of the bridge right throughout the design. But that inner rim also has another function, which is depending on the type of wood and finish on the inside and the shape of it, can have quite a big influence on how the sound actually reaches the player's ear. Because of course, most of the tone out of a grand piano is escaping through the side. But the rim has a pretty big influence over how much sound is actually reflecting back towards the player. And so that really can influence things like stereo field or a sense of whether the sound is being blended together or being kept quite separate. Suspended in the middle of all of that fat structural material we just talked about is the soundboard and the bridge. Now, its job is to take the vibrations from the string and get that soundboard vibrating so that it's moving air and creating sound waves. The whole job of soundboard engineering is to strike that perfect balance between rigidity and flexibility so that it's able to respond to even the smallest gestures from the strings while still staying nice and rigid so that tuning stability isn't affected and you get the power. Because of course, if it's too flexible, you aren't really able to translate that energy into projecting sound. It just gets really absorbed by a soundboard, which is just too flexible. So it's all about striking that balance. Now, the very best soundboards stay super responsive and nuanced, whether you're talking about very, very low volumes as well as very, very high volumes. Generally speaking, the more expensive the piano, the more time has been spent on shaping that soundboard and really engineering that perfect balance. When you get down into less expensive instruments, certainly you can by chance come across, the 1 in 1,000 gem, but most of the time they just don't have the budget and the time at the factory to really be shaping that soundboard or making sure that it's perfectly tensioned and resonant like you would if you were buying a $100,000 or $200,000 concert level piano. Even the bridge, which is this strip of wood that the strings are all in contact with, has some remarkable engineering. Now you can see on this particular piano that there's actually a series of vertical laminations of varying wood types. And the intent there is to make sure that every frequency, every partial that's contained within that string is able to communicate down to the soundboard. Because of course, if the bridge is only made of one type of wood, you might actually be getting a bit of coloring going on or filtering going on of certain partials or certain frequencies. So even that simple piece of wood, which on a violin is literally just one piece of carved wood, on a piano becomes an engineering project unto itself. Piano strings are another entire world. To a casual eye, you've really got two types of strings on a piano. You've got the silver kind, which are really skinny, and then you've got the big fat gold kind at the bottom. But a closer examination will reveal a huge variety of materials, tensions, and thicknesses being used. For instance, on the top of the instrument, there's actually a slight decrease in the thickness and weight of all of the strings as it goes from about the middle of the piano up into the top of the piano. And that permits an increase in the frequency without having to have a drastic change in the tension on the string. But bass strings for me are one of the most fascinating things, because has anybody really thought about why they have to have those copper bass strings down at the bottom? Well, it's actually just really simple Pythagorean physics. Essentially, every time you double the length of a string, if all other things are equal, for example, the tension and thickness of that string, doubling the length of the string will drop the note by 1 octave. So if you have a string that's producing, say, middle C, and that string is 1 foot long, for instance, a 2 foot long string will be 1 octave below that middle C. So it is actually possible to create a piano with all steel strings. The problem is that the piano would need to be something like 20 feet long. So piano makers came up with a solution, which is they're going to replace the length of the string with mass in another way, which is to thicken the string. The shorter the instrument, the thicker those strings have to be. So the thinner the string and the less copper, the more that fundamental frequency is able to be heard, and that's what we refer to as bass clarity. If we take a look at duplex scaling, really what this refers to as the second scale, where the string is able to sympathetically resonate. And that's the length that we're talking about on the other side of the bridge between here and whatever the fulcrum is over there. Now, although there's very little vibration, if any, which is actually going to make it from the primary part of the string through the bridge pins into the second, these are unmuted, which means they are free to resonate sympathetically. As other frequencies in the piano are activating these, just the air and the frame resonating a little bit is going to get these strings sort of active and adding thickness to that top treble. One of the biggest advancements in the history of grand piano was the development of the action, and really that's the point at which we kind of refer to the birth of the piano as taking a distinct branch off other keyed stringed instruments such as the harpsichord. And this of course goes back to Cristofori in the late 1600s in Italy when he developed the first single escapement action. Now this was necessary because as that whole concept of the piano being both a stringed and percussive instrument was being developed, they had to get around a kind of obvious problem, which is if you hit a key and you've got a hammer that strikes that string, unless that hammer is able to quickly rebound off the string, as you're striking it, you're also muting it. So how do you get that rebound while still having contact with the hammer as it swings up to deliver the power? Well, single escapement action was the solution. And up until the double escapement action developed in the late 19th century, that really was what pianos kind of looked like for a couple hundred years. So we've got the action out now, and we're taking a look at one of Kawai's actions, which are pretty distinctive and easy to spot because you can see the carbon reinforced action components, at least on the mechanical parts of it. And then you've got classic makers such as Renner, which are building actions for companies such as Steinway or Fazioli, who are using all wooden components. Of course, companies like Bechstein making their own actions in Germany. But you can see a few key components here. Obviously, we've got the key stick, which is really just a single piece of wood. Sometimes it's made out of solid wood, but often it is made out of a light laminated wood, such as spruce. And that's really just rocking on this center pin, kind of like a fulcrum and a basic lever. That is pushing up on a whipping mechanism, which is in turn pushing up on the hammer. And the hammer is that little L-shaped piece, which you're going to find pushing up right underneath that knuckle. And then once the hammer is free to continue towards the string, then that jack is resetting before the hammer is completely down, and that's what allows us to strike the key so quickly. Now, getting a piano action right is where all of the art comes down to. What I've described is the crude science of what an action needs to accomplish. But when you get into really nuanced musicality, what goes into an action is incredibly small measurements, small adjustments, and weighting individual and measuring individual components and measurements out, sometimes to the 10th of a millimeter. To get an action where every single key behaves the same, to get an action where the gradient weight from one key to the other is indistinguishable, takes dozens and dozens of hours of regulation at the factory, and that's after you already have a design which has been, tested and thoroughly engineered over the course of decades. Things like the thickness and weight of the crown of the hammer, the exact density of the felt, the overall weight of the hammer itself, how that hammer is either hardened or needled to create very, very slight areas of cushioning or hardness, to increase the percussiveness on the string. And then of course, considerations of durability and stability. How do you keep an action perfectly regulated or well regulated over the course of years and years of ownership? How do you keep the wood from warping? All of these considerations get taken into account. And this is why when you take a look at a typical grand piano, the action, whether it's the cost of materials, but more often than not, the time spent getting the action right, is a huge double-digit percentage of what you're paying for in that action. Now, the last aspect of grand piano that we're going to talk about are the pedals. Now, most people are aware that the right pedal on a piano is called the sustain pedal, and what that does is it lifts up all of the dampers. And so you can see it's this bar that is lifting up all of the dampers on the bottom 4/5 of the instrument. And so what that looks like from the top is you can see all of those little black things lifting up and leaving the strings free to resonate. There are not dampers on the top octave and a half or so of any piano. In other words, the pedal is not going to have any effect if you play the top octave or top octave and a half of that instrument. Those strings are always free to resonate at their own liking. Now, the middle pedal on most grand pianos is a sostenuto. It's very seldom used in modern pop or jazz playing, but there are specific areas of classical music where sostenuto is more prominently seen. And the whole idea of sostenuto is like it's a selective sustain pedal. Whereas a sustain pedal will lift them all and drop them all simultaneously, a sostenuto pedal will, let's say that we had this note that was being played. So this would be up, and then you press your sostenuto pedal. That will now stay up while the other ones are down. So you can manually select certain notes to sustain while the rest of the instrument is not sustaining. And then the left pedal is called an unicorda. In most cases, when you press the unicorda, there's actually 2 strings being played instead of 3. But the whole idea is as I press this, it shifts the entire key bed. And so with the key bed out, we can see this lever that's moving from the left to the right. We'll get the keys back in, and I'll show you what that looks like now with the left pedal being used. So now the keys are back in. You can see that by pressing that left pedal, it's actually sliding the keys over, probably by about 1/2 inch or so. And of course what that does is it's shifting the hammer so that rather than striking all 3 strings, it's primarily just striking 2 strings, at least when we're talking about the trichord strings that pretty well are about 2/3 of the piano. So I hope you've enjoyed our journey through a grand piano, all of its major components and what they do and how they work. If you're new to the channel, we'd really appreciate you hitting that subscribe button because we love the community that continues to grow here. My name's Stu Harrison, this is Merriam Pianos on YouTube, and we'll see you again soon.